I'm hungry. These 3 words, spoken by a childish voice, echoed through the courtroom like unexpected thunder. The room, once filled with tension and formality, stopped. Judge, lawyers, police officers, and even the quiet murmurs of the audience froze. All eyes turned to a little black girl, just 6 years old, with big innocent eyes, who was tugging at the hem of her mother's skirt with a serious, sincere expression. In the middle of a tense trial with the rigid Judge Emerson, known for his lack of patience and inflexible decisions, a child's innocent statement completely transformed the atmosphere. But how did this little girl and her mother end up there? And what happened after that shocking statement? This is a story that goes beyond the unexpected, revealing not only the challenges faced by a single mother, but also a twist that no one in the room could have predicted. The morning started like any other for Joanna, a 28-year-old black woman, a single mother, who did everything she could to support her daughter Emily. They lived in a small apartment in a humble neighborhood in Detroit. Joanna worked 2 jobs, in the morning as a cleaner in a hotel and in the evening as a waitress in a restaurant. Every penny they earned went towards keeping a roof over their heads, food on the table, and Emily's basic needs met. But that day would be different. Opening her door, Joanna found a bright yellow envelope pinned to the doorframe. It was a notice from the court. With no time to worry about details, Joanna remembered the parking ticket she had received weeks before. She had been parked in a handicapped space while running to get medicine for Emily, who had a high fever. She knew she couldn't pay the $250 fine and hoped she could explain it to the judge. Joanna looked at Emily, who was playing with an old teddy bear in the living room. "We have to go to court today, my princess," she said, trying to sound cheerful, even though her heart was heavy. Arriving at the courthouse, the atmosphere was overwhelming. People in suits walked quickly, lawyers checked papers, and policemen maintained a rigid posture. Joanna squeezed Emily's hand tightly as she tried to find her way to Judge Emerson's chambers. He was known as the heartless judge, rigid, inflexible, and famous for handing down harsh sentences, regardless of the circumstances. Inside the courtroom, the atmosphere was cold. The beige carpet, gray walls, and fluorescent lights made the space seem even more oppressive. Emily held her mother's hand as she looked around, puzzled. Her eyes stopped on Judge Emerson, sitting in his imposing high seat, examining the papers in front of him with an expression that mixed boredom and severity. When Joan's name was called, she took a deep breath and walked to the defense bench, with Emily at her side. Judge Emerson's cold gaze was fixed on her as he leafed through the case papers. "Ms. Joanna, you're here for illegally parking in a handicapped space. How do you plead?" Joanna tried to explain. Her voice was low but firm. "I was just trying to get medicine for my daughter. She was ill, with a high fever. It was an emergency, sir." Before she could finish, Emily, who was standing quietly next to her mother, stepped forward and interrupted. "I'm hungry." The statement was direct, honest, and unexpected. There was no shame or hesitation in her voice. Just the pure, sincere need of a child. The impact was instantaneous. The room, which until then had been plunged into a formal silence, became a sea of shocked expressions. Murmurs broke out in the audience, and even Judge Emerson's stern face revealed a slight surprise. Joanna felt her face burn with shame. She bent down and held Emily's shoulders, whispering, "Daughter, please, not now." But Emily, with her childlike innocence, replied, "My tummy is rumbling, Mommy." Judge Emerson leaned forward slightly, his eyes scanning the small figure before him. Silence returned to the room as he, known for his stiffness, looked genuinely puzzled. "What's your name, young lady?" he asked, his normally harsh voice taking on a softer tone. Emily looked straight at him, unafraid. "My name is Emily, and I like pancakes." The audience, who until then had been trying to keep their composure, couldn't hold back a few muffled laughs. Even one of the policemen in the room turned his face away to hide a smile. Joanna, mortified, tried to apologize. "I'm sorry, sir. She's just a child. We had to leave the house early and didn't have time for breakfast." Judge Emerson raised a hand, silencing her. He looked at Emily for a moment longer before leaning back in his chair, crossing his fingers in front of him. "Well, Emily, it seems you're very brave to speak your mind. It's not often that a child interrupts a court." Emily's eyes lit up. "I'm just hungry, sir." The judge was silent for a few seconds, clearly pondering something. Then, unexpectedly, he picked up a small bell from beside his desk and announced, "We're going to take a break. Recess for 10 minutes. The room went into shock. Judge Emerson, the most rigid man who had ever occupied that courtroom, was interrupting the session because of a hungry little girl? The silence in the room turned into a hubbub of murmurs and exchanged glances. Judges didn't usually interrupt sessions, least of all the inflexible Judge Emerson. He was known for his strict schedule and disdain for distractions. But there he was, walking out of the side door of his bench while the audience watched in complete amazement. Joanna felt her heart race. She quickly bent down to Emily, grabbing her shoulders. "Daughter, you can't talk like that. This is no joke." But Emily just smiled with the innocence of someone who didn't know the impact of her words. "But Mom, my belly was making noise. I couldn't wait." The audience continued to exchange curious glances and whispers. Police officers, lawyers, and even the other defendants watched, intrigued. Joanna didn't know what to think. She wanted to disappear, but something about that pause, that moment, seemed different. The usual rigidity of the courtroom had given way to an atmosphere of expectation, as if everyone was waiting for a mystery to unfold. Minutes later, the side door opened again. Judge Emerson returned, but he wasn't alone. In his hands, a small tray carried 2 simple plates, and on top of them, warm pancakes, covered in shiny syrup that dripped down the sides. The room fell completely silent. The judge placed the tray on his bench and looked directly at Emily. "Miss Emily," he said with a tone no one had ever heard before, "pancakes enough to satisfy your hunger?" Emily's eyes widened. Without a hint of hesitation, she smiled and replied, "Yes, sir." Her sincerity drew muffled laughter from the audience, but this time Joanna noticed something different. The laughter wasn't debauchery, but delight. Emily, with her simplicity, had broken through the barriers of that cold room. The judge signaled to the bailiff, who brought the plates to Emily. The little girl grasped her fork enthusiastically and began to eat right there, while the murmur of the spectators filled the room. Joan, still stunned, tried to apologize. "Sir, I don't know what to say. I'm sorry for—" "Don't say anything, Mrs. Joanna," interrupted the judge, raising one of his hands. "Sometimes it takes a child to remind us of the important things in life." His normally stern voice seemed to carry a note of reflection. Something had changed in him. As Emily happily ate her pancakes, Joanna noticed that attention was not only on the girl, but also on the judge. He watched the child with a gaze that seemed to cross the years, as if he were seeing something that no one else could see. Finally, when Emily had finished her meal, wiping her mouth with a napkin offered by the bailiff, the judge resumed his posture. He tapped his gavel lightly to silence the room. "Let's continue." Joanna felt her heart squeeze again. It had all been unusual, but reality still loomed over her. The $250 fine. The weight of yet another bill she couldn't pay. The fear of having to return home without a solution. She clasped her hands in her lap as the judge picked up the papers once again. "Ms. Joanna," he began, his eyes fixed on the documents, "I have read your case carefully. I understand that you parked in a space reserved for the disabled. That, under any circumstances, is a serious offense. However," he paused, raising his eyes to meet her directly, "the circumstances are unique." Joanna felt the air escape from her lungs. The silence in the room was absolute. Even Emily, now satiated and calm, looked at the judge curiously. "You were trying to get medicine for your daughter, who had a fever. An emergency, of course. But understand, what you did is still against the law." The words fell on Joanna like a stone. That was it. He would keep the fine. Maybe even increase it. She was already thinking about how to ask for an installment plan when the judge continued. "However," he said, pausing dramatically, "it is obvious that you are not a person who flouts the rules out of habit. You're a mother trying to do the best with what you have. And your daughter," he looked at Emily, who was smiling at him. "Well, she reminded me today that sometimes, the law must be accompanied by compassion." The room seemed to hold its breath. "Therefore, I decide that your fine will be annulled." The shock was palpable. Joanna blinked, as if she wasn't sure she had heard correctly. "Annulled," she whispered, her voice barely coming out. "That's right," said Judge Emerson, with a slight smile. "But there's one more thing." Judge Emerson paused, adjusting his glasses as he looked at Joanna again. There was something in his gaze that mixed firmness and empathy, a combination that no one in the room expected from the man known for his severity. He continued, "I'm going to do something I don't usually do, but which I believe is necessary in this case." He took out a blank sheet of paper and began to write. I'm writing down some contact information and resources that can help you and your daughter. Social support services, free food, and even a local program that helps single mothers find better jobs. He finished writing and handed the paper to the bailiff, who took it to Joanna. She took the paper with trembling hands, her eyes filling with tears as she read what was there. They weren't just contacts. They were opportunities. Things that could change her life and Emily's. I don't know what to say, she whispered, her voice breaking with emotion. You don't have to say anything, replied the judge, leaning forward slightly. Just promise me that you'll use these opportunities to do the best for your daughter. She deserves it, and so do you. The murmur in the room grew again, this time with tones of admiration. No one had expected that. It was as if that moment had transformed Judge Emerson in front of everyone's eyes. The image of the cold, merciless man was being replaced by something much more human. As Joanna tried to process what had just happened, Emily, who was sitting next to her mother, tugged on her arm and asked quietly, but loud enough for everyone to hear, "Mommy, is the judge a hero?" The courtroom erupted in hearty laughter. Even the judge, who rarely showed any emotion, let out a genuine smile. He looked at Emily and answered with a sincerity that surprised everyone. "No, young lady, I'm not a hero. But today, you've reminded me what it means to be human. And that, yes, is something I will never forget." The atmosphere in the room had changed completely. There was a lightness in the air that contrasted with the tense atmosphere that had dominated the beginning of the session. Judge Emerson, known for his reputation for rigor, now seemed almost approachable, someone capable of empathy. Before closing the case, the judge lightly banged his gavel and said, "This court is adjourned for 15 minutes. I think we can all use a moment to reflect." The audience was taken by surprise. It was unusual for a judge to adjourn in this way. Some whispered, others looked at Joanna and Emily with admiration. However, what happened next was even more unexpected. As Joanna and Emily prepared to leave the room, the bailiff approached them again, carrying a small envelope. "This is for you, Ms. Davis," he said, handing over the envelope with a slight nod. Joanna opened it carefully and found inside a generous meal voucher for a local restaurant. Enclosed was a handwritten note. "Sometimes a simple gesture can change a life. I hope this is the start of something better for you. Emerson." Joanna felt the tears flow freely. She looked at Emily, who was busy holding the paper with the appeals the judge had given her. "Mom, now we can eat real pancakes," she exclaimed, making the whole room smile again. As they left the courtroom, Joanna felt something she hadn't felt for a long time: hope. Hope that, even in the face of all the difficulties, there were people in the world willing to help, to see beyond the circumstances and offer a second chance. But the story wasn't over yet. As Joanna left with Emily through the large wooden door of the courthouse, something surprising happened. A reporter who was in the corridor, covering other cases, noticed the commotion around them and asked to do a brief interview. "Ms. Davis," he began, with a respectful tone, "can you tell us what happened in there? It sounds like it was an extraordinary moment." Joanna hesitated, but then looked at Emily, who encouraged her with a smile. "It was more than extraordinary," she replied, her voice still choked. "It was the first time in a long time that I felt someone really saw us, you know? Not just as a case or a number, but as people." The interview with the reporter quickly gained attention on social media. The story of Joanna and Emily, and of Judge Emerson, began to spread as a powerful reminder that small acts of compassion can transform lives. Joanna's words resonated deeply. He didn't have to do anything, but he chose to make a difference. Meanwhile, back in court, Judge Emerson sat in his high chair, staring at the gavel in his hands. He wasn't a man for grandiose gestures or emotional speeches, but that moment with Emily had touched him in a way he couldn't explain. Perhaps because, for a brief moment, he had been torn away from the cold, impersonal routine of his job and brought to a more human, more vulnerable place. Over the next few days, Joanna's life began to change. The food voucher was just the beginning. With a list of resources the judge had given her, she was able to sign up for a support program for single mothers, which offered access to free food, daycare assistance, and a professional training course. For the first time in years, she found herself with a clear path to a better life. Emily, for her part, became a minor celebrity at school. Teachers and classmates listened attentively as she recounted, with her childlike enthusiasm, how she had asked the judge for pancakes and how it really made him smile. Her innocence and courage began to inspire other children and even the adults around her. A week later, Joanna received an unexpected phone call. It was from Judge Emerson's assistant. "Ms. Davis, the judge would like to know how you're doing. He also mentioned that there is one more resource that might interest you, a community fund that can help with housing costs." Joanna could hardly contain her emotion. The idea that someone like Judge Emerson cared enough to follow her situation moved her deeply. That simple act of caring had an impact she would never forget. In court, Emerson himself also felt the reverberations of that hearing. He began to look at cases differently, seeing the people behind the paperwork and the infractions. He knew he couldn't change the system alone, but he could make daily choices that would make the world a little fairer, a little more humane. Months later, Joanna and Emily were in a completely different position. Joanna had gotten a better job, which offered more flexible hours, allowing her to spend more time with Emily. They had moved into a small apartment closer to Emily's school and Joanna's work, which made their lives less stressful. On Emily's birthday, something special happened. While Joanna was preparing a simple cake, Emily ran to answer a knock on the door. "Mom, it's the judge," she shouted, her voice full of excitement. Joanna was paralyzed, but soon went to the door. There stood Judge Emerson, without his robe, but still with his imposing presence. He was holding a small wrapped box. "I don't usually visit outside of court," he began, with a slight smile. "But I thought I should bring this for Emily." He handed the box to the girl, who opened it in a hurry. Inside was a small storybook, with colorful illustrations and a note, "For Emily, who taught me that even judges need to remember to smile. Never stop dreaming. Love, Emerson." Emily looked at him with her eyes shining. "Thank you, Judge. Do you want pancakes? Mom makes the best." Everyone laughed, and Emerson accepted the invitation. In that small kitchen, as the smell of pancakes filled the air, three very different lives connected in a unique way. It wasn't just about pancakes or a kind gesture. It was about hope, humanity, and the reminder that, even in a world full of rules and judgments, there is room for empathy and connection. When Emerson said goodbye, he felt something he hadn't felt for years, a deep sense of purpose. Joanna and Emily, for their part, felt that they had found not just an ally, but someone who believed in them. This heartwarming story reminds us that acts of kindness, even the smallest ones, can change lives forever. What did you think of Emily's attitude when she asked for pancakes and Judge Emerson's decision? Leave your opinion in the comments and share this story with friends and family to spread this powerful message. And don't forget to subscribe to the channel for more heartwarming stories that make us reflect on the true meaning of humanity. See you in the next video.